So I think we're going to get started here, folks. For those of you that weren't here when I introduced myself earlier, my name is Chris Benson. I work for Peguis Consultations and Special Projects under Mike Sutherland. So we're here talking about the Netley Marsh Restoration Project. We have Steve Strang from the Red River Basin Commission, as well as the chair, Dr. Gordon Goldsborough. We're going to go over this entire project, what we hope to accomplish with it. This is a very exciting project, something that I'm very excited about. My family has a history in Netley Marsh that stretches back to about 100 years as waterfowlers, and I've seen the degradation of this marsh, how the habitat has been lost, and I'm sure as Indigenous people, you've also seen that, seen how the habitat has been destroyed through various means, how animals and plants and wildlife are no longer using the marsh. Dr. Goldsborough has been an amazing individual. He's been involved in coastal wetland restoration projects for most of his career. He was one of the key people that helped the Delta Marsh project. If you guys know anything about that, Delta Marsh is the sister marsh to Netley Marsh. It's at the south end of Lake Manitoba, and it suffered from many of the same problems that Netley Marsh does. Primarily common carp, which are an invasive species, which Dr. Goldsborough will speak about. Hopefully I'm not taking away too much of his thunder, but he was, I could talk forever. So that marsh has been restored, and as a hunter and as an environmentalist and as a photographer, I've seen what happens when you restore these wetlands and see how the animals, the plants, and the wildlife respond. So it's amazing. So we're hoping to do the same thing with Netley Marsh. We've handed out some surveys for you. We're recording this seminar and this consultation meeting in the hopes that we can put it up on our Facebook page and share it. So for those individuals, band members that couldn't join us but have an interest in this project, we can send this to them, this link to them, and they can take part in this meeting and take part in the survey. And we want your feedback. If there's culturally significant areas or anything that you have in that area that you want to let the governing bodies of this project know about, please share it. If you have questions, please ask. So without further ado, I'll ask Dr. Goldsborough to come up and he can start the presentation.
Well, thank you all for coming this evening. I would like to tell you a little bit about Netley Marsh, but before I do, as Chris mentioned, I have spent most of my career, I'm a wetland ecologist at the University of Manitoba, and I started working on wetlands in 1981, so that's 39 years ago, at Delta Marsh. And what you may or may not know is that Manitoba has more large marshes than any other part of Canada, and in fact, the two largest coastal marshes on the continent, in all of North America, are right here in Manitoba. The Delta Marsh at the south end of Lake Manitoba is the second largest one, and the Netley-Lebo Marsh at the south end of Lake Winnipeg is the largest one. Oh, right, okay. So we have an abundance of these wetlands here. Now, unfortunately, as Chris mentioned, they are deteriorated. Their quality has gone down, and it's because of a whole lot of factors. You know, it's invasive species, it's alteration in their water levels, it's climate change. I mean, there's lots of factors, and we could go on and on and on talking about them. You know, we did, for example, do an experiment at Delta Marsh where we kept carp out of the marsh, and the transformation in that marsh was absolutely astounding. You know, a marsh that they told us had never had significant numbers of ducks in the last 40 years is now teeming with ducks because they're there because the habitat has been restored. You know, wildlife doesn't exist in a vacuum. It needs the habitat, it needs the vegetation, it needs the other animals to interact with. You know, and that had been lost at Delta Marsh. And so I was very proud to be involved in the project at the Delta Marsh to bring some of it back. The Netley Marsh likewise has gone through some dramatic changes. You know, you hear some of the elders talk about being limitless numbers of birds in the past in the marsh, or muskrats, or fish, you name it. And this is definitely not the case anymore. And so what we've been trying to understand is what are some of the major factors that are causing it? And there isn't just a single factor. There's several of them. You know, but one of the major ones is that the vegetation has disappeared. A large area of the marsh that used to be vegetation is now open water. And yes, there are common carp there. And yes, probably some of the changes have been caused by carp. But unfortunately, it's not as easy a solution to that problem as it would be at Delta Marsh. And it's because of the nature of the marsh and how it's connected to the lake. There's larger channels that connect the marsh and the lake. And so it's not as easy to just close them for carp the way we did at Delta Marsh. So what I want to describe for you this evening is essentially what our thinking is as to how we could at least restore some part of the Netley Marsh. And before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge that the project that I'm describing is not a single entity doing. It is actually many different partners working together. The University of Manitoba, say where I am, is one of the scientific partners. We bring some of the expertise to the problem. So I'm a wetland ecologist. One of my other colleagues at the University of Manitoba is a civil engineer. And so he's bringing some of the engineering expertise. We also have the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. Manitoba Hydro is involved. People sometimes, point fingers at Manitoba Hydro as the cause of many of the problems, but they take the view that as long as the solution is based on good science, they're involved. They're actively involved. They have helped us in many important ways, and so I want to acknowledge that. Peguis, of course, is a major partner. I know when we first started talking with the elders in Peguis, they were interested because, of course, they appreciate the importance of a healthy marsh in many ways in terms of the fur-bearing animals, the fish, the medicines, and so on. The International Institute for Sustainable Development, the South Basin Mayors and Reeves, the group of municipalities around the south end of Lake Winnipeg, the Southern Chiefs Organization, Ducks Unlimited Canada, and of course, the Red River Basin Commission. And they're all working together. I mean, to my mind, this is one of the most fulfilling aspects of this project, that it's brought together people who traditionally maybe wouldn't have worked together. And we're all there because we feel passionately that the marsh should be restored. So I wanted to just emphasize, this is not a project by any one group. It's a whole lot of people participating and working together. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of context, this is a photograph taken from an aircraft back in 1923. Now I know it says there 1913, but there's a bit of an explanation required. The photo itself was taken in 1923, but what it shows us is this channel right here that was dredged in 1913. In other words, 10 years before the photo was taken. This is the Red River. We're looking kind of south. This is Netley Creek. I don't know why it suddenly blanked on me. Sorry about that. Netley Creek, of course. And what we see in the foreground is in the right-hand side of this photo, a huge amount of vegetation. This is what, in wetland science terms, is called hemi-marsh. Hemi means half. Hemi-marsh, therefore, means half marsh. And what it basically is saying is that we have a mixture of vegetation and open water. From the standpoint of birds, things like ducks and geese, that hemi-marsh is ideal because it provides them with cover, it provides them with a place to nest, it also provides them a place to feed, and that's the sort of habitat that ducks really thrive in. Now, this channel here is called the Netley Cut. And it was excavated. It was dug by the federal government in Canada. And you might ask yourself the question, why did they dig it? Well, there's lots of answers that I've come across. In addition to being a scientist, I should point out, I'm also a historian. And I was interested in knowing the history of that channel. So I dug into some of the archival records. And it turns out they claim that it was intended to drain the marsh. at least when there was a big storm that brought a lot of water in, that this would help drain some of that water out. There were other explanations too, and to be honest, I'm not sure I'm convinced that any of them are really the real reason. But anyway, it was dug in 1913. 10 years later, you can see there's something there and there's something there. They actually discovered that maybe this wasn't the best thing after they had dug it, and they tried to plug it. So they actually sunk a barge, that's the sunken barge right there, and then they built sort of a weir, sort of a pile dam across it right there. Well, anyway, that's what it looked like in 1923 when the photo was taken. And this is more or less how it looks today. From that roughly the same perspective. Well, this is of course taken down a much lower on the ground. This is the remains, this part right here, this is the remains of that cut. In other words, it had started out being, well, actually narrower than these two pillars are apart, narrower than that, and now it's actually wider than the Red River. And it's getting wider. In fact, I can't remember now, I think there's a graph there that shows the rate at which it's getting wider. Maybe I should just go into the next picture. Oh, there we go. So that's what it looked like in 1923. This is what it looks like today, and there's basically been a loss of all that hemi-marsh. Well, no hemi-marsh means no habitat for waterfowl, for ducks and for geese. And so that's really, I think, the major part of the story of the degradation of the Netley Marsh. It's gone from what we see on the right to what we see on the left. So here's another picture of the sort of the same perspective. There's that cut again. Notice how wide it is here. And this is actually a graph that one of my students put together. She looked at some old air photos along with some archival information that reported on the width of the Netley cut, that channel there. And what you can see is that actually it was dug in 1913 and it actually closed. By the time you get to 1930, it's closed. And it remained closed up until about 1968 or 1969. Now, we don't know what happened in that year, when 68 or 69. Something happened though, and it reopened. And since then, it has gone up at an amazingly straight line rate. And the result is now, one of my colleagues, the civil engineer that's involved in our project, he estimates that on any given day, between a third and a half of all of the flow of the Red River now goes through that channel. You know, it didn't used to, of course, before that cut was excavated, it used to go straight down the river out into Lake Winnipeg. And now it goes through here. We know that, in fact, this has made worse, the amount of water going through there, by the provincial government. The Manitoba government has been intentionally breaking the ice right about here in the spring when they're expecting there to be, flooding, because the idea is they want flood water to go in here. In fact, that's kind of what we're seeing here. There's flood water that's pouring into the marsh in the early part of the summer. And that's also probably contributing to it. There's lots of contributors. It's a complex problem that doesn't have a single cause and therefore probably doesn't have a single answer either. But I want to tell you a little bit about what we intend to do. We're doing a pilot restoration project, and I want to emphasize the word pilot, because what it means is we're not talking about going out and restoring the entire marsh next year or the year after or the year after that, because to be honest with you, the restoration is going to take years. It won't happen in a single year. It won't happen in 2 years, 3 years. Probably is going to get it all back would probably take decades. But we want to demonstrate how it could be done. In other words, we want to show how it can be done and then hopefully get more people involved to make it happen. So that's why it's a pilot project. It's a 3-year project. We'd like it to be longer. I'm a scientist. Scientists always want to do more science. They always want to keep studying things. They don't want to stop. They don't want to, move on to something else. They want to keep doing what they've been doing. I would like to go on longer than 3 years, but of course the reality of the amount of money that's available is going to determine how long we can go. So right now we're saying 3 years, and that will perhaps be as long as it's going to go. And the idea is to demonstrate the techniques for creating vegetation, and I'll show you how we intend to do that. And we're going to do it in a small area of the marsh, and I'll show you where that's going to be. And I'm going to show you how we propose to do it using material from the bottom of the Red River. In other words, we intend to use sediment from the Red River to make places in the marsh that are shallow for vegetation to reestablish. Okay, first of all, where? So here is the Red River going through the middle of the marsh, coming out into Lake Winnipeg right there. To the west of the mouth of the river, there is a sort of a triangular shaped lake called Hardman. And then down near the bottom where the Netley Cut is, the cut is right there. This is called Netley Lake. And we propose to have 2 sites. Now, whether we can do 2 sites may not happen. You know, the reality is, of course, having 2 places doubles the cost. And we may not have the ability to do it twice. But the idea is that we want to show how it's possible to do the restoration in 2 quite different environments. So this site, for example, is quite sheltered. You know, it's protected by the wind, by the beach ridge here from the winds. Whereas this site, as you might imagine, it's got this great big open body of water, much more prone to, you know, wind sweeping across, big wave crashing in. So a very different environment. And so the thinking is that if the restoration can succeed in this environment, it'll probably work everywhere. This is a close-up of the 2 sites. So this is the Hardman Lake site. This is the mouth of the river right here. This is the area that we propose to do the experiment. If this is the A site, here's another view of it looking here. This is the site B site. This is again the Red River over here, and here's the edge of the Netley Lake, the 3 areas we want to look at. Again, looking at it from above. Now you might say, well, what are the 3 colors? Well, again, this is meant as a pilot project. We don't know how the best way to do it is going to be to create vegetation, but we know that we have to somehow hold in, if we're going to bring sediment in that we're dredging from the river, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment, we have to hold it somehow, and we're proposing to do that in one of 3 ways. So the red area here in the middle is using what's called an aqua dam. It's basically a water-filled tube. The green area down here is what's called erosion control. Well, that's where we use, well, we're hoping anyway, we can use some natural materials, some natural straw products that to hold in the sediment. And then the third area, the yellow up here, are geotubes. Those are large tubes usually filled with either sand or with soil. And the idea is to put those structures in and then fill these areas with sediment, so that we create at least shallower places that the vegetation can establish. Because that's the key. The water of the marsh, unfortunately, is too deep to vegetate naturally. And we know that because when these last 2 summers, 2019 and 2020, we've had some unusually low water levels on Lake Winnipeg and therefore on the Red River. And as a result, we have seen dramatic vegetation growth because the marsh levels have come down because of the low water levels, and the vegetation has grown back. Unfortunately, we can't assume that it's going to stay that way, and probably won't stay that way next year. It'll go back to normal levels. The water will be too deep. Nothing will be able to grow. So although it's nice to think that we could raise or lower the levels of the marsh so as to let vegetation grow, we don't think that's terribly likely. So the alternative then is to make the marsh shallower by bringing the bottom up, by putting stuff in the bottom and raising the bottom up. So this is how we propose to do it. Now you may have seen these before. They operate them on the Red River fairly often. The Amphibex dredgers, there's 4 of them, are there, Steve? 4 of these dredgers. And traditionally, in Manitoba at least, they have been used as icebreakers. You'll sometimes see them going out in the springtime. They're breaking ice to let it move more freely during the spring melt. But it turns out the original use for these devices was not as icebreakers, but as dredgers. They were invented by a company in Quebec, and the idea of them is that they can do hydraulic dredging. Now, this is not dredging as we might have thought of it 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, not where they have a big scoop that reaches in and grabs a big handful of muck and lifts it up and then dumps it into a bucket and then goes for another big handful, because that's very destructive, and that creates an awful lot of murky water, which is bad for things like fish, it's bad for mussels, it's bad for lots of aquatic life. This is a hydraulic dredger. So think of it almost like a vacuum cleaner for water. It's got a sort of a tube on the end, and it sucks up the mud on the bottom and then pumps it out a pipe and can send that sediment up to 5 kilometers. So basically it's a big sediment mover. And so the idea is that we could use that to pump the sediment over into the areas where we would contain the sediment. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I mentioned before, 3 options of way to do it. The aquadam on the right with the water-filled tubes, the geotube on the left filled with sediment or with sand, and in the middle we have these erosion control blankets. Basically, it's rolled straw. Now this is a geotube that was installed on Lake Manitoba. Just to give you an idea of what they look like, this was at Delta Beach over at the south end of Lake Manitoba after the big storm of 2011. And this is kind of what it looks like. But the idea would be that these would be put in and then this area would be filled with sediment, not necessarily to be above water, but just shallow enough that the vegetation would regrow. Now this technique that I'm describing, using sediment that's pumped out of the river to fill an area to make it shallower for vegetation, this is not a new technique. It's not something we invented. In fact, it's been used a lot in the United States. If you go, say, to the southern part of the United States, to Louisiana, where they also have lots of wetlands, they do this fairly regularly. And it's a fairly well-established technique. I think we can see enough of those things. Here, this is an example of the sort of thing they're building in the United States. This is a photograph from a national wildlife refuge in Louisiana. And this was this one, as you can see, is above water. It doesn't have to be, but you can see that they've created this sort of berm, this terrace, and the vegetation is starting to grow because that's what happens when you create shallow habitat. Vegetation grows naturally. Now, we don't know whether natural regeneration will be sufficient here, so we're already preparing for the possibility of having to do plantation as well. That, again, we might engage people to go in and help us plant some of these, and that's going to be part of the experiment, is to see whether natural regeneration will be sufficient or if it requires plantation. We'll hopefully find that out in the course of our experiment. So the idea then is this is the Netley cut. Oh, by the way, remember I said the water levels in 2019 and 2020 have been low. This is a photograph taken from, I think, 2018. And is actually, you can also see the shallow areas here, here, and here. This is the part that actually grew in pretty well with vegetation this year. Oh, actually 2 years ago too. And this is the site B that we want to do the experiment. This is the area that we want to use to pump the sediment from. And you might ask a question, well, why do we choose that area? Well, it turns out, remember I said before, Manitoba Hydro has been an active partner in this project. One of the things that they have provided us with, they sent a crew out and they mapped the entire river for us. They told us where the shallow places are, where the deep places are. They mapped the whole thing. They spent several days doing it. And they found there were 2 major areas where there was accumulation of sediment, 2 places where it was getting shallow. One of them was at the mouth of the river, and the other one was right here. So, you know, the interesting part about this is that it kind of is, there's 2 potential benefits. One is that we demonstrate the techniques for potentially creating habitat for vegetation. We're also addressing a shallow area in the river that makes it harder for boats to travel. And there are places, and I'm sure anybody who's boated on the Red River knows that there are places where it's pretty shallow. You know, it makes it hard to take any kind of large-sized boat. And so the possibility, for example, the Nemeo, the research ship, the one that travels around Lake Winnipeg collecting water samples, the one that gives us information on the health of Lake Winnipeg, cannot travel down the Red River. It is simply too shallow. If it could get to Selkirk here, it could then use, for example, the dry dock that is owned by Peguis here in Selkirk. Well, unfortunately, it can't get here because it's too shallow, and that might therefore address the problem. So there are multiple benefits of this project. So what are those multiple benefits? Well, we create vegetation. That's the initial objective, at least. And that'll provide habitat. It'll provide habitat for the fish, for the fur bearers like muskrats, for some of the birds, the ducks, the geese. There's also potential for biofuel, because ultimately we could harvest the vegetation and use it as a natural fuel. And there are demonstration projects already happening in Manitoba. There is, for example, a turkey barn not far from Selkirk here that has experimentally heated the barn using cattails, burning cattails as fuel to heat their barn. So there's potential for that as well. So we get fish, we get waterfowl, we get fur-bearing animals, harvested marsh vegetation, medicines. We also get nutrient and storage of carbon. You know, and of course we talk these days about global climate change. We talk about the declining health of Lake Winnipeg, the fact that the pollution of the Red River is causing the algae to flourish in Lake Winnipeg. One of my colleagues at the university did a calculation that the amount of phosphorus, which is one of the key drivers of algae, that's one of the causes of algae in Lake Winnipeg is phosphorus, that the vegetation in the marsh, if it was restored to the way it looked back in the 1920s, it could offset the pollution of the Red River by the City of Winnipeg. It also reduces flooding and bank erosion potentially, because it would slow down the water as it passes through the marsh. And then, as I mentioned, it might help also improve navigation on the Red River for things like the Nemeo. I think we're pretty near done. I just want to tell you just a little bit about how this is going on. We have a committee. We have a group of scientists that is overseeing the actual experiment, so that when we do this, we do it with the best information possible. We have an overall steering committee, which is not just scientists, but people from other walks of life as well. We used to meet fairly often. Unfortunately, this last little while, not as often as you might imagine. And the Red River Basin Commission, I should point out, has been the glue that's held this all together. You know, the fact that we have all these various groups involved, I think ultimately it was essential that we have somebody and some structure to kind of bring it all together and hold it together, and that's been the Red River Basin Commission. From day one, Steve Strang has been the guy that's been pushing everybody to keep things moving forward. So I need to give them a big shout out. It wouldn't have happened without the Red River Basin Commission. We have partners, and as I mentioned some of them at the very beginning of the presentation at the top, we also have funding agencies. The money that we've obtained to do this experiment has come from a number of places, and I wanted to acknowledge, for example, the Selkirk and District Foundation has been very generous in its support. The South Basin Mayors and Reeves, the Manitoba Wildlife Enhancement Fund, Environment and Climate Change Canada. So our project timeline, and it's had to be revised and revised and revised again, is that we've been collecting information. We've been collecting, for example, the federal government and the provincial government have asked us for information, which we have provided to them. They are still evaluating that information. We are meanwhile carrying out some baseline scientific studies of the vegetation, wildlife. We've been doing census of birds. We've been looking at fish in the area and so on. This year we've been focusing mainly on the consultation process. And so hopefully that the beginnings of the actual work outdoors will be starting next fall. We don't suggest to start any earlier than late July or early August, mainly because we don't want to in any way interfere with natural bird breeding or fish spawning. You know, we want all of that to be done before we do anything that potentially could be harmful. So we would begin that sort of midway through the year, start the building of those terraces that I showed you that picture of, and then start doing the monitoring, seeing what happens. Do the plants grow back? And of course, some of that will happen next year, but the real growth is probably going to take place in 2022. And so the 3 years, essentially 1, 2, 3, most of it being in 2 and 3, that's when we really hope to be able to show this works. And hey, then we would kick this into high gear. So that's what the basic project is. It's a demonstration of a technique to restore the marsh that we hope will carry on indefinitely.